Harris uses a precursor to his player or play condition theory from his defense of Dark Souls 2 to argue that Fallout 3 tries to teach players certain behaviors that will negatively impact the gameplay. Many of Harris's criticism for Fallout 3 are made under the assertion that this prototype theory, proto for short, of player conditioning is in fact a truth. In a response to the defense of Dark Souls 2, Mauler criticizes player conditioning name and how Harris uses it in the video's argumentation, and why don't I let the man speak for himself?
And honestly, this is why the Bloodborne video is just terrible. It's the narrative structure poisoning the analysis, like with Noah's Outlast video. He makes everything about how Dark Souls essentially forced you to use a shield, while Bloodborne teaches you that shields were a mistake that From Software want to retroactively fix. He says that he isn't sure about this, so I'm not going to go into him too hard, but I despise it when people invent new design labels when there are either ones in existence or that can describe it in simpler terms. Play conditioning, or the act of a video game directing the player with set pieces and mechanical instructions, is what happens when the player simply plays the game. It means players are responding to the way the world talks to them and how it reacts based on their actions, how it implies what they're supposed to do with a particular thing. For fans of my channel, I call it the tutorial when it's signposts and instructional stuff like objective lessons. And if we involve stuff that's a little bit more like the developers are trying to guide you, then I call it guidance. Though I'd say tutorials come under guidance as well. It's like an umbrella term. Mark Brown called it the invisible tutorial, and many other critics call it as it is, a set piece or set pieces in a game telling you how to do something without telling you directly. The thing is, it's been around since before Half-Life, and Harris for some reason thinks this is a new classification. I mean, the poor bastard has some guy copy his video beat for beat and make hundreds of thousands of views out of it, which I genuinely feel for Harris on, since if you're gonna copy work, copy the good stuff at least. The problem with guidance in video games is that it's just that. It doesn't dictate a player's route or path. This is one of the reasons Harris's argument will fall apart and he'll be using extremely slippery language throughout.
Why player conditioning and this proto-theory in Fallout 3 are not the same thing. There are enough similarities to say that Harris is using it as the same presupposition that has to be established before any of the following points or criticisms can be validated. If this proto-player conditioning theory is flawed or just wrong, then most of the following arguments or criticisms will be invalid. This is the case for Harrison's criticism of lockpicking and hacking. BomberGuy later on claims that Fallout 3 has poor visual design and writing.
Thanks to the poor visual design and writing, it's often very difficult to know how to get somewhere once you decide where you want to go, or what exactly to do when you're doing a quest. The world is so big and full of junk that, for most of the game, if you're doing a story or optional quest, you can't rely on the game to tell you where to head visually. You have to look at the arrow on your radar. And down here is the biggest travesty in the history of video games. Okay, it's not that bad, but it's pretty bad.
There's much more to this argument, but many a true nerd counters this claim of Harris's rather efficiently.
And I want to examine this initial journey in detail, as it really demonstrates the level of care and craftsmanship that goes into Fallout 3's world design. Because like I just said, you can run off in any direction, so how is it the game directs you to Megaton? Now sure, there's a quest marker, but not everyone's going to realise what that means, not everyone's going to respond to it, and not everyone that sees it is going to want to obey it. You see, the map immediately around Vault 101 is slightly more empty than most of the rest of the wasteland. The consequence of that is, if you turn around outside Vault 101, there are only compass ticks to the east, the direction of Megaton. Now even if you're completely ignoring the compass, the world is ready to guide you. You see, there's a small sign in front of you promising a scenic overlook. It's pretty much the only thing of note and the only text in view when you step outside of the vault. Step over that and immediately look straight down the road to Springvale, immediately drawing your attention there. Even if you completely ignore that and just jump straight down to the road, the more interesting view is to the left, down past the cars. Walk past them and you see Springvale below you. To your right is just some rocks. You could go that way, sure, but the game subtly tries to draw you to Springvale. And once you get to Springvale, you see the Eyebot in the distance, the bright flash of red of the Nuka-Cola machine, and the red rocket sign. It all just slowly draws you in the right direction. And once you get into town, Megaton is clearly signed. And
While not using this proto-theory, Harris does not mention the arrow on your radar trains a player to constantly look at it until a little later in the video. Once that argument is put forth, it is followed up with the claim that the arrow on your radar makes the player lose awareness of their surroundings. Approximately 5 minutes of the video is used building up this theory of his to use as a tool to criticize many other elements of Fallout 3 throughout the rest of the video. I believe the Many a True Nerds clip made a strong argument that countered Harris's first claim about the arrow on your radar. And once Harris gets to the evidence that the arrow on your radar trains a player, it comes off as circumstantial at best and comically ridiculous at the very worst, which might be his style.
You probably didn't even notice you were doing it, but the game's objective marker slowly turns you into an idiot with no awareness of your surroundings. Here's a review from 2014.
Also, stuff like you thought Liberty Prime was sick.
I thought he was awesome because he was there the whole time and you never paid attention to him.
Liberty Prime is a gigantic fucking robot. You have a bunch of opportunities to see it. You cannot avoid seeing it when you walk into the room. It is literally impossible. And yet, somehow, these players missed it until it was the thing you were following for the last quest.
In the section where BomberGuy talks about the Super Mutants and Brotherhood of Steel separately, there is major poisoning of the well going on. In simpler terms, he gives most of the context for the Super Mutants and Brotherhood of Steel in the first Fallout game, explaining how they are, how they came to be, what they're like, along with some major praise, while leaving out much of the context around the Super Mutants and Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 3, with a large amount of complaints of them thrown in for good measure. Just to highlight this, I timed the amount of time that Harrison talked about each of them in their dedicated sections. BomberGuy approximately talked about the Super Mutants of Fallout 1 for 1 minute and 15 seconds. And then he went on to talk about the Super Mutants of Fallout 3 for 25 seconds. The Brotherhood of Steel was actually quite longer. He spent about 4 minutes and 20 seconds on the version of them in Fallout 1, and spent about 1 minute 35 seconds on the version in Fallout 3. Anyone who watched this might be fooled, but if you were paying attention, you can see the time difference for yourself. Of course, this is just an estimate. Harris has a style where he'll flip between 2 different versions of the group, add some meta commentary, and a dash of his humor embedded in the script. To demonstrate what I believe is a more honest look at the Super Mutants and Brotherhood of Steel from Fallout 3, I pulled a clip from Many a True Nerd.
Anyway, let's talk about the mutants overall, because I have seen them mentioned as a disappointment, and this seems to be because people don't see the mutants as interesting and complicated, next to how they were in Fallout 1. Just because you've never played it, the original mutants were created as part of a plan referred to as the Unity. Humans will be converted to mutants because humans were unsuited to surviving in the wasteland, partly because they were just physically frail and vulnerable to radiation, and partly because they were constantly bickering amongst themselves. A single group of hardy mutants might have a better chance. It's a really great story for the mutants, because the Master has a point. We do repeatedly in Fallout 1 see different groups of humans fighting each other and struggling to survive in the wastelands. The mutants of Fallout 1 also aren't brutes. They have a plan, they have leaders, they have human allies who are helping them, they set patrols, they can maintain a military base in working order, they challenge intruders, they follow orders. In short, they're a society that has structure and a goal, and while it's different, a case can be made that they're not the bad guys. And accordingly, the Master can't be talked out of his plan by telling him it's wrong. The only thing that talks him down is providing proof that his mutant army is sterile, and thus his unity, if ever accomplished, would be a dead end that inevitably dies out in the long term. By comparison, many were disappointed by the mutants in Fallout 3, who initially seem almost more like orcs. They hang up gore bags, they yell short, poorly formed sentences, they run at you screaming with a board with a nail in it. They don't seem like a society, they just seem like animals. And I think that interpretation is wrong, and that there's actually some really interesting stuff going on just below the surface with the mutants of Fallout 3. What we see in Fallout 3 is Richard Gray's worst nightmare, and it's entirely consistent with Fallout 1. You see, the idea of super mutants being big dumb brutes wasn't a Fallout 3 invention, it's absolutely in Fallout 1, most famously in the case of Harry, but Richard Gray's diary makes it very clear that most mutants are very stupid. In fact, to quote Richard Gray, "The few wanderers that have found their way here have been a disappointment to me. They can't seem to mutate correctly. The best I've been able to create are some big and dumb mutants. Most can recall nothing from before I initiated them into the wondrous unity." But it's not as obvious in Fallout 1, because most of the mutants don't speak at all, they just shoot you on sight. But given Harry's entire team is characterised as stupid, it seems reasonable to suggest that actually, the vast majority of Fallout 1 mutants are roughly of Harry's intelligence. So why do the Fallout 1 mutants have a functioning society, but the Fallout 3 mutants don't? Mostly it's down to leadership. Fallout 1's mutants are led by Richard Gray, and by the extremely small number of mutants who maintain their intelligence, like the Lieutenant. The Fallout 3 mutants have a small number of intelligent super mutants as well, in the form of Fawkes and Uncle Leo, but rather than becoming leaders, they were locked away or driven out. It's Fallout 1 society flipped on its head, and it's tragic. Creatures that were envisioned as the next step for humanity instead embrace anti-intellectualism and drive out the few people who might actually be able to save them, regressing over time to a state where they start hanging up gore bags. And yet there's a lot more to the super mutants than even that, because they're actually grappling with the exact same problem that the Master couldn't bear to contemplate in Fallout 1. How to reproduce and survive. Just like Richard Gray, they create new mutants by dipping humans in the green stuff, as you can overhear in Vault 87, forced evolutionary vats, which aren't seen in-game but are mentioned on several terminals. And they're empty. This is Richard Gray's nightmare, a mutant population unable to reproduce, dwindling away, an evolutionary dead end. That's what the Vault 87 mutants are, but it's worse than that, because the mutants are trying to fix it, but without the benefit of the few intelligent super mutants that do exist that might have been able to help them. You see, to survive, they need two things. More humans and more FEV. Humans aren't hard to get hold of, and that explains the large number of human captives you'll find everywhere, but the FEV is a little bit more tricky. Now, if you visit the Vault-Tec headquarters in DC, there are mutants inside it attacking the robots. Why would they want to access Vault-Tec? Because they need to find more vaults, because they're looking for more FEV, because they think FEV comes from vaults. Except the whole thing's a rather tragic doomed mission, because we know for a fact there is no FEV in the other vaults. The mutants have spent years combing the DC ruins and the waste for more vaults, and even if they ever found one, they wouldn't get what they needed. They are, quite simply, facing an extinction level event, and what happens in Fallout 3 is irrelevant. Natural wastage would finish them off eventually anyway, but they persevere, clinging to the hope that if they just smash a bit harder, they can survive. One faction I've most often seen raised as a problem with Fallout 3, the Brotherhood of Steel. Now, to some people, the Brotherhood are a big problem, and it seems to boil down to one big issue. The Brotherhood now acts in a more overtly benevolent and open fashion that feels strangely at odds with how the Brotherhood used to act in classic Fallout. Now, I'd like to address these points directly, because I'm not really sure they stand up to any scrutiny. Firstly, the Brotherhood has not changed, because this isn't the Brotherhood. And I don't just mean because this is an independent cell acting alone in a hostile environment nearly 3,000 miles from Brotherhood Command, though that is true. I mean that they literally aren't the Brotherhood anymore, and the game explicitly says this.
Lions directly refused orders, and so the West Coast cut us off. No communications, no reinforcements.
And in case that was too subtle, they even added in the Outcasts, a faction that left specifically because Lions wasn't following standard Brotherhood operating procedure. This isn't some lazy retcon, this is a small group that in one particular time, in one particular set of circumstances, made the choice to be something slightly different, and they've had to accept the loss of their friends and being ostracised from their own order to pay for that change. Though let's actually examine how much has changed in Lions Brotherhood, because I think that's massively overstated. You see, older Fallout fans will probably expect the Fallout 3 Brotherhood to lock themselves in a secure location which they refuse to allow you access to, but that's exactly what they do. Just like in Fallout 1, they occasionally send out kill teams to hit super mutant positions if it's advantageous to them, though being slightly more open than previous iterations of the Brotherhood, they still treat outsiders with suspicion and disdain.
Is this the idiot who blew our ambush?
And there's also just a weird little coincidence that in both Fallout 3 and New Vegas, you access the Brotherhood bunker for the first time when a female companion who already knew them asked to be let in via an intercom. But really, that's all superficial stuff. Let's look at the core conflict that's always existed at the heart of the Brotherhood. Is isolationism good or not? In Fallout 3, Lyons has already decided the answer is no. He's opened up his Brotherhood to the outside. But that's not a change. That's pretty much been the standard arc for the Brotherhood in every game. In Fallout 1, the Brotherhood are initially locked away in their bunker, but at the end of the game you can persuade the Brotherhood that the mutant threat is severe enough that they should come out and assist an outsider with dealing with it. And that's not a one-off. The canon ending to Fallout 1 goes as follows.
The Brotherhood of Steel helps the other human outposts drive the mutant armies away with minimal loss of life on both sides of the conflict. The advanced technology of the Brotherhood is slowly reintroduced into New California, with little disruption or chaos. The Brotherhood wisely remains out of the power structure and becomes a major research and development house.
Reintroducing technology and acting as an R&D house. In fact, their arc is pretty clear. They start off as isolationist hoarders, learn that's a dead end, and thus become more open to engaging with the world, albeit from a safe distance. In fact, Fallout 3's Brotherhood fixed that end pretty much perfectly. They have their citadel, but they're also trying to help the world around them, while simultaneously keeping it at arm's length. And bear in mind, Fallout 3 takes place over a century after the events of Fallout 1 convinced a High Elder of Lost Hills that engaging with outsiders in the outside world was sometimes necessary. Is it really so ridiculous that a century later, some Brotherhood leaders might come to the exact same conclusion?
Overall, Many a True Nerd's video does a great job at pushing back on most of BomberGuy's Fallout is garbage video in Fallout 3 is better than you think. Harris has either forgotten many details of Fallout 3 or has omitted certain elements of the game to build his case against Fallout 3. That can be clearly demonstrated with the Super Mutant and Brotherhood of Steel examples from before. The comparison of side quests seem a little unbalanced, but it really ties into the moral system that he's trying to make an argument that Fallout 1 is better than Fallout 3 on the choice of morals, or at least choices you can make dealing with morality. On the Fallout 1 side, you have a quest about trying to decide between the morals of killing the sheriff to let the local crime kingpin take over, or siding with the sheriff to get the evidence to lock him up legally. And on the Fallout 3 side, you just have that evil quest to blow up Megaton. Harris talks plenty about the Fallout 1 side quest, but for the Fallout 3 quest, it comes down to defusing the bomb, killing Burke, or blowing up Megaton. If you choose the first two options, this is completely true. But if you actually go to Tenpenny Tower, undecided on whether or not you're going to set off the bomb, trying to decide, talk to the man, there are another set of choices you'll be faced with when trying to get into the tower.
Another fun one that many people miss is Tenpenny Tower. The setup is that Roy Phillips wants to live in the tower, and Tenpenny and the other residents don't want ghouls there. You can kill Roy, help Roy take the tower by force, or persuade the tower residents to allow the ghouls in, after which point most residents accept the ghouls actually turned out to be okay. It all seems very clear. The moral, good, proper option is the last one. Except if you do that and you return a few days later, the humans are gone. Search around and you can find a pile of corpses in the basement. Roy planned all along to murder the humans and take the tower for himself and his ghoul friends. So once you know that, perhaps the best option is to kill Roy and his gang. 4 people dead to save the tens of people who live in the tower. Well, 2 small issues there. First, you have to wipe out his whole gang, which includes Bessie, a shy and completely oblivious ghoul who absolutely has no idea about the plan. And secondly, the reward. The only way to get the ghoul mask is to help Roy, either by directly helping him to storm the tower or persuading them to let him in, both of which end in the tower's inhabitants all dying. And the ghoul mask is great, especially if you've got Broken Steel installed and the feral ghoul reavers start showing up. Are you willing to condemn an entire society to death for a valuable unique item, given the vacated tower will go on to be a home to ghouls anyway?
There are many other examples in Fallout 3 that could be given, including both the Herald and the Republic of Dave quest, that debunks the claim that you don't get any choices and that it's a simplified moral decisions that you'll be making in this game. But since Harris kept his side quest examples down to 1, I will do the same. Still don't know how BomberGuy could have gone to Tenpenny Tower and not known of this quest line. Probably just sweet talked his way through the door and skipped the quest on his evil way. Earlier on in the video, in a brief section when Harris talks about Fallout 3's weapon durability system, he sort of misses one major thing. And that one thing is that there are vendors who can repair weapons. It seems like an important thing to mention when you criticize the game for giving you useless or terrible guns because of them being in poor condition. There's also the factor that he explains you need the same weapon to repair one, which is not the case when you repair at a vendor. I also find it amusing that this is one of the few times Harris mentions the possibility of putting skill points in really anything besides combat skills. He talks about repair, and he will be talking about the crazy idea of putting it into energy weapons since you haven't seen anything before. Despite omitting or maybe forgetting about these details, despite his favorite NPC Mauler being one of the merchants who can repair gear, he says,
"This means that the game ends up handing you a weapon that's about as weak as all your other weapons. You can find laser pistols in the mart outside Megaton, but guess what? At this point you probably haven't put much points into energy weapons because you haven't even seen one yet. And they're in such low condition that they're equivalent to the weapons you were already using. I've conferred with friends on this, and several of them were led to believe that laser weapons were useless because the ones they found were garbage. This isn't just me and my weird pals either. The internet is really unsure what to think about energy weapons because the first ones you encounter are terrible. Plus, the repair system wasn't great. Because you could only repair a weapon if you had another of the same weapon, a lot of rare and supposedly powerful weapons could rarely, if ever, be brought up to even a fraction of their actual power.
It also strikes me as a little weird. BomberGuy neglects to talk anything about armor at all. Sure, he talks about some of the gear boosting stats and not liking that because it's a change from Fallout 1. But he does not talk about the durability going down with damage at all, from what I remember. And I've gone over this video a lot. When it comes to combat in Fallout 3, armor is a very important element, and the fact Harris does not mention it at all sort of baffles me. I'm guessing he thought he already had this covered by stating 90% of the combat in Fallout 3 is very easy. Yet, Harris does not talk about the combat of Fallout 3 very much beyond this. Armor is an important element in the game along with meds to heal and a few stat boosters. There's no major significant focus on either of those elements, if at all, and Fallout 3 is garbage and here's why. Luckily, many a true nerd has that covered, along with some other details that BomberGuy criticizes Fallout 3 for, such as having easy and stupid combat in the game and not being a real RPG.
That in Fallout New Vegas, you absolutely 100% always wanted to immediately wear the highest damage threshold armor you could find because a single point of damage threshold made a huge difference. Let's do the same thing in Fallout 3. With damage resistance 6, you take 395 damage total. With damage resistance 11, you take 374. At that point, damage resistance is not necessarily the absolute priority, and that opens the door to making tactical choices about armor. You see, Fallout 3 introduced loads of armor that had interesting stat changes attached to it. You could sacrifice a bit of damage resistance for more agility, more sneak, more endurance, more perception, big guns, explosives, luck. And I think that made armor a lot more interesting. Sorry, that was a bit of a digression. Let's get back to Fallout 3's atmosphere. Naturally, this damage resistance system suits the grim post-apocalypse perfectly, because in Fallout 3's early and mid-game, you are vulnerable, and you can go down pretty quickly, as anyone who's ever accidentally run into an early game super mutant brute with a minigun knows all too well. This also works alongside Fallout 3's combat mechanics, which I think don't deserve all the criticism they get. Yes, combat is slightly clunky in Fallout 3, and that's good, because Fallout 3 isn't a shooter, it's an action RPG. And because your character isn't a soldier, they're a teenager from a sheltered environment whose only experience of gunplay is their BB rifle. Sure, you can take manual shots and sniper shots, and small engagements I may well often handle manually, but the slight clunkiness means that VATS has a purpose, because VATS yields good results, and that means that action point management, perception, and a whole bunch of perks are worth taking to improve VATS.
Sorry if that was a bit long and maybe a bit boring at certain points, but with that, I will close my case for now. Feel free to argue with anything I say that you would like to in the comments section, or just find me in a back alley somewhere. You can even argue with Many a True Nerd if you like. Only found his channel and researching this topic. And soon I will be arguing, metaphorically through a live reaction on stream, who seems to disagree with Many a True Nerd in a video that I got recommended while digging into this topic. The video is called Fallout 3 Isn't Better Than You Think. With that, I'm done.